Welcome everybody. We've got so many wonderful guests that we don't usually have. So welcome to the College of Environment and Design. We are celebrating 50 years as a college and 90 years as teaching landscape architecture. Many of you might have known or heard of Hubert Bond Owens, our founding father. He is much celebrated here. But we are looking forward to another 50 years confronting some very challenging issues in our world, as you all know. I'm Melissa Tufts, and I direct the Circle Gallery, which y'all all get to go to momentarily, and the Owens Library. I want to thank our wonderful dean, who's right here, Sonia Hurt.
There's a spot for me.
Yes, we always save you a place. Also, I want to thank Tom Jones, our wonderful IT, and he's the czar of all things technical, and we appreciate your help all the time, Tom. I want to thank Liz Solomon and Mickey Boyd and Beth Gavrilis and some very nice lifesavers whom I won't name right this minute, but they came and saved the day this afternoon, and one of them's initials are Lynn Abduni. I think one of the best ways to celebrate ourselves is by acknowledging one of our very favorite alums, Philip Juras. Philip is a painter, an author, and a conservationist. And we've got 2 of his books on sale. The UGA Press is here, thanks to Steve Wallace, another person to thank. So glad you're here. By way of introduction, I just want to say that Philip took a very important class that I also got to take too, and it was just a dream of a class, and it was with Darrell Morrison. Darrell was our dean for about 10 years, and he brought a very profound sense of the importance of native landscapes to our college and sort of set us on a new path when he arrived. And that class was amazing. You were totally immersed. And I'm talking about in the Okefenokee Swamp, the Cumberland Island, all the way up to the beautiful balls in the Smoky Mountains. So we spent a lot of time botanizing, drawing, writing, and just learning to look carefully and deeply at our surroundings. Philip took that class and pretty much never came back out of the woods. Some of his paintings are for sale in the exhibit. We are not in the business of selling paintings, but you can talk to Philip directly, and it's going to be a little chaotic because we got so many wonderful folks here, but I can help too. I can take notes if you see a painting that you are very interested in. At the end of this, we'll have time for just a few questions, and then we'll go see these gorgeous work and have some refreshments. So again, so glad you're all here, and thanks for being here. Take it away, Philip.
Thank you. Thanks a ton, Melissa. You have done such a beautiful job of installing that exhibit. It is gorgeous. I really can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and to Mick and Liz who helped hang it. Beautiful work. And my goodness, there's 3 seats for cool people down here, by the way. One there. And I'm really thrilled that so many of you are here because you're also fans of conservation like I am. This is great because that's what we're going to talk about. And, it really all started here in this building and also here, in another sense, with the School of Environmental Design. And I'll get into that. So I grew up in Augusta, Georgia, with a family that really loved nature. And some of them are here today, so I got to say this right. But we got to go out camping in the mountains of North Georgia and North Carolina, go out looking at spring ephemerals in Sumter National Forest near Augusta, where we lived. And I really got to love these places where nature seemed to be at its best, sort of untouched, this untouched idea of nature. That's really where it all started for me. And at the same time, I also had a real interest in art. We had books on the old masters and Renaissance artists and impressionists around the house that I found interesting, and exhibits at the National Gallery in Washington. And I also had a knack for drawing, that sort of all came together eventually to bring me to the University of Georgia Art School, where I enrolled in 19-something. And,
Philip, do you want to do the voice?
oh yeah, thank you. And this is going to help explain some of these things. So that love for art brought me to the University of Georgia, really, where I enrolled in art school, and I learned about new ways of seeing the landscape that I wasn't even aware that I was learning in art school, learning about composition and color, and negative space and positive space, and the picture plane, and really a new way of seeing is what I got out of that I still basically stand on today as a foundation. I also took my first painting class in art school on the Studies Abroad program in Cortona, which is a phenomenal program, in 1988 for me. It was my first painting class and my first chance to paint the landscape, beginning, as you can see, with this sort of impressionist view of a wonderful church that's in Cortona. And I continued to paint landscape through my studio classes back on campus here in this building, but not very much because there were a lot of other things to learn in art school as well. And landscape wasn't the only subject I was interested in, obviously. In my senior exit show right here in the front hallway of this building, it's interesting there's an ashtray there too, but I got to explore. And it's so cool that this is now the same wall of the gallery that I'm exhibiting in 20 years later, which is really awesome. I'm glad to be back. It's 30 years later. Wow. But it was after school that I got to really get into exploring landscapes, especially the landscapes of travel, painting en plein air, outside even this great big canvas. I tied it down to the bushes so it wouldn't blow away on the Missouri River in Great Falls or in Massachusetts. And by doing these field paintings, I think this is where I really began to learn about sense of place, something I would pursue more in landscape architecture. And in field painting or sketching, you really observe things closely and you take them in and record them in a way you wouldn't if you just took a photograph. It was an important, informative time for me. But in 1993, I was beginning to realize I had better get a real job. And one thing I knew is that I didn't want to be an artist for a living. So I came back to the University of Georgia, to the main library, and my research told me that I should go into either forestry, ecology, or landscape architecture. And one of those had the chance of being outside and drawing stuff, so that's the one I went for. And I was fortunate to be accepted into the MLA program in 1994, I believe, and I got to learn a whole bunch of new ways of seeing landscape that I assume students are still learning today. I mean, obviously things like plan view and perspective, but important concepts like understanding the choreography of moving through a space, or understanding how landscapes can be read in terms of mystery and complexity and coherence and legibility. Those are really important lessons for me, and I use them now. But I also learned the idea of wearing many hats, which is what landscape architects do. Able to synthesize information from an engineer, from a horticulturist, from a designer with a big ego, and to put that together and present it in a usable way to a client. And that presenting was also an important part of my art career. Well, and by taking Daryl Morrison's Plant Communities class that Melissa also enjoyed so much, I was able to continue my exploration of southeastern natural landscapes these landscapes that I was beginning to really, frankly, it was Daryl's class that made me realize that this was the subject matter I was most interested in. And I really would sort of go far down that rabbit hole with my thesis under Richard Westmacott, and I got to examine what the condition of the pre-settlement Piedmont was like before Europeans arrived. And based on the historical writings, natural sciences, and understanding how ecosystems are put together, I was able to kind of get a picture in my head of this pre-settlement landscape. And I'm still exploring this subject today. In fact, just a couple of years ago, I did a field painting that's in the exhibit of a beautiful site in Sumter National Forest that was part of my thesis research however many years before, 20 years before. Still a beautiful place and managed very nicely with fire by the Forest Service. But before I got to that, I would go, Beth and I, my wife and I, would move to Alexandria, Virginia, and I would work for Roadside and Harwell for 2 years, which was a fantastic landscape architecture firm. Really interesting and challenging work, but I think as I sat at the computer doing AutoCAD, I realized I wasn't outside drawing enough, perhaps, and decided really what I should be doing with my life was a lot more artwork. Before we left, though, before we moved back to Georgia, I had the chance to explore a phenomenal landscape near Washington called Dolly Sods. And in that landscape are all these wonderful patterns of both nature and culture, these different uses, as well as these historic patterns. And of course, looking at it in that sort of plan view that might be appropriate for someone in the landscape architecture field. But back in Athens, I was able to really pick up where I left off with the plant communities studies, beginning with Rock and Shoals, for instance, right here in Clark County, a beautiful preserve owned by I think the state and the county share ownership of that. And there I could examine the kind of patterns and textures and colors that emerge in a landscape that is fairly unaffected by disturbance. And I got to do a lot of that. In fact, I re-enrolled in Daryl's class twice, so I took it 3 times in total. And on the second and third go-around, instead of a sketchbook, I carried my oil painting equipment, and I did oil sketches as we traveled to places like Cumberland Island, the amazing old-growth forests of Big Woods and Greenwood Plantation, and places like Blood Mountain with that wonderful sculptural monadnock. Really learning a lot more about these places and understand all these are field paintings, small ones, done quickly as we traveled to these spots. I also worked on larger paintings back here in my studio in Athens, which was it was downtown somewhere briefly. And one of my favorite subjects, and this of course is in the exhibit, would be Heggie's Rock, a place with outstanding design features, if you will. These wonderful dish gardens or acid pools where rainwater has dissolved the face of this outcrop. And in that are growing these incredibly interesting and rare plants like dimorpha and snorkelwort and icoides and other things. And then these arrangement of lichens and mosses and grasses indicating how much soil is forming over time as you move away from the most barren areas to these wonderful cedars and loblollies that are growing in the cracks in the rock face, defining these outdoor rooms. Beautiful place. And the reason Daryl took the class there so many times was because this is a place that's preserved by the Nature Conservancy and has been for quite a while. If it weren't, you could be sure that like the other rock outcrops in the area, it would have trash on it, it would be a four-wheeler paradise, or it would have been blown up and turned into gravel a long time ago, which is the fate of many of these. Was delighted in 2004 when Renee Shoemaker, Melissa's predecessor as the director of the Owens Library, asked me to do a show of this work in the Circle Gallery in its previous iteration on the ground floor of Caldwell Hall. Really great to do that. And then she asked me again 5 years later. So I did a second show in the Circle Gallery. But this time I was more focused on southeastern grasslands and on how William Bartram saw this landscape. And it was because of that I caught the attention of Dorinda Dahlmeyer, the director of the Environmental Certificate Program, because she was working on a book on William Bartram. And to make a long story short, because of meeting Dorinda and becoming great friends, I was able to reach a lot more people with the artwork I was doing, resulting really in an exhibition at the Telfair Museum, a book that went with that, and also being in Dorinda's book, and then everything afterward too. So I've just been holding on and trying to keep up ever since we met, Dorinda. Thank you. Of course, William Bartram was America's first naturalist, traveled the South in the 1700s and wrote about it in a way that's inspired many people, including myself. And in my project, I followed him around as best I could and had a great time going all over the Southeast, as you can see in these little dots of places where I painted. But I ranged quite far from where Bartram went because so much of what he saw is completely gone. I mean, the South has radically changed in a couple hundred years. But there are still places where you can see something of what Bartram saw. And one of them's not far away, right here on the Broad River at Anthony Shoals, where in May, mid-May, late May, you can see this phenomenal bloom of rocky shoal spider lilies. on this free-running Piedmont River going over this wide swath of bedrock. That's actually a very rare sight. So many of the places where these lilies would bloom are now underneath reservoirs. And thankfully, the Georgia DNR owns and protects this land now. Of course, another place that Bartram, I think, would recognize would be the Gulf Dunes. In the Bon Secours National Wildlife Refuge, he camped on the beach probably a few miles from here as he was sailing to Pensacola. And certainly it would have been the same at the time, an open landscape influenced by the wind and the waves, just the action of nature. And here we see these wonderful little clumps of Florida rosemary and live oaks. I think he also would have recognized the savannas of the Apalachicola. Bartram didn't go there, but he saw a lot of this environment all along the Atlantic coastal and Gulf coastal plains, that being part of the longleaf and pine environment that once occupied 90 million acres of the southeast. And today, maybe 1% of that that's in good shape is actually left. I'm so glad that I met a writer named Janice Ray at a reading she had here in Athens, and I said, where can I go to see places like you're writing about? And she sent me to the Apalachicola, so thank you very much for that, Janice. Right, so in this place, you can't tell, but down in that grass is some of the highest plant diversity per square meter in the southeast, maybe up to 40. Although it looks like a very simple environment, it's very rich indeed. And all three of these places we just saw are federal or state lands that are all places we own and can go to because as a culture we care about conservation, I would say. There are some places Bartram probably wouldn't recognize. If you go to Wormslow on the Isle of Hope, where Bartram and his father visited, you would today look at this view and see trees spanning the opening in the distance. You wouldn't be able to see out to Pigeon Island out in the middle. It's because the Skidaway Causeway crosses that now. So I reconstructed the view as I think the Bartrams would have seen it, and made the creek a lot bigger too, since it's silted in today. And you surely wouldn't recognize anything of the Black Belt Prairie of Alabama. That was a landscape that was hard for me to believe, and when I read the travels, because I couldn't imagine a prairie, an actual prairie, being in the South. Here we have so much rain that you should have a forest and any patch of dirt in 10 or 15 years, right? But he was writing about openings that were miles wide and miles long in extent. So I wanted to recreate this vision, this view, and to do that, I looked at historic surveys. And on these surveys, I've outlined in the red, I've got the route that Bartram traveled, and in yellow, I've got the areas that the surveyors have described as prairies. And for scale, each one of these squares is 1 mile by 1 mile. So that means that this is a crossing of a prairie that's 5 miles wide. These are really wide open prairies. You might not have a tree for 1.5 miles, the closest thing to you. And then I traveled there myself with the modern day conditions in my route in blue to see what I could find, and found suburbanization and a really rather rural landscape that didn't have any prairie species that I could find in it, or any hint of the past except for a historical marker. However, I did see the lay of the land, and I got a sense for the atmosphere of a summer day. I went to the other end of the Black Belt in Mississippi to look for remnants where I could find the kind of species that should have been down there in Alabama. And here, like is so often in the case in the Southeast, grassland remnants are only to be found in roadside ditches or under power line easements. And again, in another beautiful little remnant in a wildlife management area where I did a little painting amongst the prairie grasses. And that painting's up in the exhibit. I brought all that back to my studio and put together a view based on that topography and the sort of the idea of those really long distances and the atmosphere of the summer day, and then into the foreground, the prairie species, for a view of the Black Belt prairie that Bartram, I think, certainly would have recognized and that hasn't been seen for 175 years. He probably would be a little confused on Wyabald as well, near Franklin. He crossed Wyabald on his way into the Cherokee Nation, and he found, when he was there, he described these breathtaking views of mountains piled upon mountains because he had a completely unobstructed view on top of this open bald Today, when you go to Wyobald or next door on Westerwald, you'll find that trees cover the mountaintops. Whatever factors it was that kept them open, megafauna like elk, or later cows and sheep, or maybe fire, the Indians, perhaps the Cherokee, perhaps burning these landscapes, those have been removed, so they've gone back to forest. I had to climb a fire tower to have the kind of view he would have had. And naturally, he wouldn't recognize walking around downtown Athens because of obvious reasons, but really any Piedmont upland as Athens would stand on would be hard for Bartram to recognize, I think, because we're used to forests in the Piedmont regrowing as very shady, dense places with a nice mid-story and understory, but not these wide open grasslands with a lot of sunshine, open space, these characteristic old oak trees and prairie species in the ground plane. That's because the amount of fire that was in the landscape before the time when Bartram came in before was much more frequent than it is now. I mean, now it's basically zero. Fires, probably mostly set by Native Americans, would have moved through these Piedmont woods on a regular basis, maybe every 4 years or every 12 years or something in between that, keeping them in this condition. So fire was a really important part of the pre-settlement landscape. And it was fire, these were fires set by humans. So I thought, naturally, I need to be one of those humans. So 10 years ago, my good friend Shan Kamak, and mentor as well in the world of fire, inspired me to get trained up to be a wildland firefighter. And that's allowed me to volunteer on prescribed fires with the DNR and the TNC around the state. For the last 10 years. And here I am painting on my very first fire at the Moody Forest Preserve down in South Georgia, a Nature Conservancy preserve and also a joint DNR effort. I've gotten to return to Moody over and over through the years to burn it, to paint it, and most recently, in 2017, to paint it while being filmed for an upcoming documentary about William Bartram, or about the people who are inspired by William Bartram today. I'm very excited about that coming out, but that's not my news to share. So, painting fire has been a great adventure. I've burned with tall timbers at the Wade Track in Thomasville. I've burned with the DNR at Tallulah Gorge, and these wonderful fires that make a landscape, it's like you're approaching Mordor. You know, it's really cool. But honestly, as bad as that looked, that's exactly the effect that's wanted for this ecological restoration, creating a landscape that's going to be very attractive to bears and turkeys and particularly grouse as well. And there's a lot of pines in this system that have to have fire for their pine cones to open. And down at a TNC preserve, Broxton Rocks, I promised that tree was not killed by that fire. And again, a DNR burn at Laura Walker State Park with the explosive saw palmetto, and then a combined Georgia DNR and Nature Conservancy burn on the Almo Tract in the fall line sandhills of West Georgia. And this was a great experience. So I should point out that what we're looking at, we're standing in the green here, which means we're standing in fuel, and that fire is being blown toward us. So this is a situation where you really want to stay on your toes, and you need to know where your escape route is and where your safety zones are, which I do and did. So I had to retreat several times while I tried to paint this head fire coming toward me, roaring through this wonderful canebrake. It's a great subject, and I felt I had to do a bigger painting on that. So I thought I would show you how I put together that bigger painting, which is featured in the exhibit. These are 1 hour intervals as I worked on this painting, although the first one's a half-hour interval. Because a lot happened in a half hour, with this 2-inch brush, I've already determined the composition and basically the colors for everything. And within an hour, I'm settling on the values and contrast. And really, so for the next, I'm not going to tell you how many hours, I'll be working out all these aspects of painting, the texture, keeping things in balance as I work across the canvas. Here I'm really concerned at the beginning using larger brushes with just getting things worked in as a mass. And I just saw that was 3 hours of really knocking out the foreground. That was exciting. And now I'm moving back into the middle ground and just kind of going back and forth and trying to get things to balance and respond to each other and to the way I feel like this is like I have a completed painting. And it's surprising, looking at this, that I'm not done already. I mean, it's still going on. As you can see, 35 hours, 36. Really working with small brushes now to get those last details that I think I need to show to represent what it's like in that environment. And then after 42 or 43 hours, over a few months, I have a finished painting of this wonderful burn, this wonderful fire roaring through that little cane break on the Alamo Tract. I've also gotten to paint fire on a place called Little St. Simon's Island, and they use fire there for a variety of reasons as a management tool, and in this case, a fire that was set on the backside of the island to help manage their old growth slash pine forest. And that fire went late into the night, and I got to do a night painting of a fire, which is very exciting. That doesn't happen very often. Maybe you can see the stars up there too. They also use fire on the seaward side of the island, where there are these wonderful grassland shrubland communities that harbor the highest population of eastern diamondback rattlesnakes anywhere in the world. Super cool. And it's a great thing. It really is, because within that means that to have that many top predators, you have to have a very healthy ecosystem. And these fires are important for maintaining the grassland, which is what those rodents really need. And of course, the snakes need the rodents. It's a great cycle. And it's a beautiful environment, particularly in the fall when the muhly grass is in its fall color. It's so hard to say exactly what color of pink or purple it is, especially as the sun comes up. It just changes entirely from moment to moment. So I always enjoy studying that in these quick studies like this one. I was really fortunate to be able to work on Little St. Simon's over a 5-year period and to put together a whole body of work to show what an intact natural barrier island looks like on the Georgia coast, and then exhibit that at the Morris Museum in Augusta, and have a book produced with the University of Georgia Press, which I'm very proud of. That book is beautiful, and the press did such a great job. Well, Little St. Simon's is also a great story because it's a story of conservation. Here's a case where private owners over the years decided not to develop, and in the end decided to put the whole island into a conservation easement. And that's a really powerful thing to consider too, because we're all, in some ways we're all able to participate, whether it's on a grand scale or a small one. I'd love to tell you about Martha's Vineyard, but I'm going to ask you to just read what I wrote that's in the exhibit. It's a fascinating backstory about this place. I mean, it's never been an uninhabited island. So a whole different approach to conservation I got to learn when Beth and I were invited to go to the high elevation grassland in the Andes called the Paramo, outside of Bogota, Colombia. And there I was able to do lots of field paintings on 2 separate trips, both in the grassland, the Paramo, and also in the cloud forest, which is a little bit lower down in elevation. And of course produce studio works back in the studio. This is an amazing environment. Chingaza National Park embraces the area we're in. It's an area where a couple thousand species are conserved in that national park, and probably just as important, where the 8 million people of Bogota get their drinking water. Much of it harvested by these fine textured plants. Both the hairs on these silvery plants, the hairs on their leaves, as well as the fine blades of that Calamagrostis grass, attracting water and funneling it to the ground and eventually into the stream system. The same thing happens a little lower elevation with the cloud forest, which acts like a sponge to hold that water during dry periods and release it gradually. So much diversity there. God, that place was beautiful. There were orchids hanging in the trees and bromeliads, and wow, unbelievable. If you ever get a chance to go to the cloud forest. But the cool part about this that makes it a new way of doing conservation for me was to be able to participate in this sort of different level of sponsorship. The Wildlife Conservation Society and the National Park System of Colombia sponsored both an exhibition and a poster that was given to school kids in towns all around the national park so they could learn about it and become more familiar with it as a natural place. and then an exhibition in Bogota celebrating the national park's 40th anniversary that was attended by President Juan Manuel Santos, which was a great honor for me and really helped to promote the exhibit to the public, because it was in a public space, in a library, where hopefully thousands of people saw it and got the idea that they now had an idea of where their drinking water came from and why that was important. We showed it again in Washington, D.C. at the Inter-American Development Bank, where decisions are made on a daily basis on what kind of things happen across Latin America and South America and the Caribbean. And if these paintings in any way influence those decisions, that would be wonderful. So a whole different way of doing conservation is more from the ground up. And my latest project, I've gotten to explore that. Here's a beautiful prairie restoration in the suburbs of northwest Chicago called Galloping Hill. And we're looking at an effort that's a combination of private volunteers and the county that owns this land coming together to make prairie restoration possible that neither one of them could have done by themselves. And they've repeated it over and over so that there are wonderful prairies, healthy, functioning prairie ecosystems around Chicago in places that were formerly corn and soybeans, like this. And of course, they make great subjects for painting. Another example of that is a private organization called the Citizens for Conservation. They've taken a 40-acre piece of private land and over 30 years have reintroduced a prairie to it that a botanist couldn't be able to tell the difference between that and an actual high-quality remnant. It's truly astounding work that they're doing in the Chicago area. And it's just beautiful when all these flowers are in bloom, the echinacea and the lead plant and the prairie clover. But probably the biggest, most impressive example of this model that I've seen is happening at Nechusa Grasslands, a nature conservancy preserve in north central Illinois. And here I got to see something I learned in landscape architecture in an urban planning class, where I studied something called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which was about how stakeholders are so important in making any process happen successfully. What they've done in Nechusa is invited citizens, volunteers, to come and do the work themselves, to give them ownership of 5 acres of prairie. What happens there, what species go there, is up to you. It's your decision. We'll provide the expertise and the tools. And by repeating that model over and over again, they've restored almost 10,000 acres of prairie to old corn fields and soybean fields. And they've used the seed source that they've gotten from these stony outcrops where the tiny prairie remnants were hanging on. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, and they've been doing a lot of painting there. They also have another restoration crew at work that showed up at Nechusa in the last few years, actually. American bison reintroduced to Illinois after over a century of absence. And these guys do a great job of rearranging species and creating niches for other animals that depend on that kind of diversity in the prairie environment. They found in the very first year, they saw that their data was showing a positive response in the biodiversity at Nechusa. I had a great time painting this too. Those guys that are out there on the left all came around me as I was set up. And I had a UTV, so I got back inside the UTV and I just listened to them as they slowly walked by and constantly ripping off grass, moving and ripping off grass. They never stopped. And the sound of sort of the soft grunting that they make, and then of course the bird song, and it was absolutely beautiful. Huge animals too, my goodness. Fire is an essential tool in managing prairies. In fact, prairies don't exist without fire. I've been doing a good bit of prairie fire painting too, and it's great because if you think about tallgrass prairie extending over from all over the Midwest all the way out into Ohio, those are areas that there's enough rainfall to have forests. Prairies really shouldn't be there historically, but for thousands of years people have been setting them on fire, extending them, creating this ecosystem on a wide landscape scale. And all these pictures all the pictures I just showed you, except one, will be part of an exhibit I have coming up at the Chicago Botanic Garden, all about the Prairie ecosystem in Illinois. And I'm really looking forward to that opening on May 8th. And until September, I hope you guys can come up to Chicago. And if you do, please get in touch with me, because I'd like to point you to some of these beautiful remnants and restorations. They're absolutely delightful to explore on your own. Well, when I look back at all these paintings, this is virtually a retrospective of my work. And it's really a couple of things strike me about what I've learned. One is that this idea I had as a kid about how awesome untouched nature is, it doesn't really jive very well. It doesn't really exist, frankly. As humans, we've touched every corner of the world, either with our footprints or with our emissions. And we have a relationship with nature that is inescapable. We, of course, dependent on it to be alive, and it depends on us, too. These prairie ecosystems wouldn't exist without thousands of years of people expanding them into the territories they are now. Never had thought about that human-nature relationship that way. And I also and of course, the other thing is that I'm just so thankful to be able to experience these places. It wouldn't happen if those who came before me hadn't cared about keeping nature intact and enacting conservation measures and making things happen. I mean, to be able to know what weeds to pull out of a prairie restoration, or to know how to reintroduce fire to a fire-starved pyrrhic ecosystem, those are things that are wonderful to do wonderfully well. It takes a master, and frankly, I think that's where you'll really find the true art of conservation. Thanks.